So, David, in your piece in The Nation, political corruption is ruining everything, but we can fix it. You cite a couple of examples. I feel like since the piece has come out, we have probably a half dozen more that we have found out about this week. Right. Not the least of which is some type of pay-to-play operation coming out of the president's right-hand man. But, I don't know if it's any different from Corey Lewandowski, who seems to be doing this for months at the least. But tell us about...
Go ahead. The Trump administration certainly has highlighted the level of corruption, public corruption, littered throughout the system. That's not to say that it wasn't present prior to then, but it certainly has kicked up a notch in terms of its visibility.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. I mean, I want to go into some of these examples, but broadly speaking, I can't tell if and maybe it's a little bit of both, but if the Trump administration is, because of the people they hire and because just broadly speaking, it signals to everybody. I mean, I've been in situations where I've been in, how can I put this diplomatically? I have been in enterprises where at one point it appears like everybody is trying to grab what's not nailed down and run. And there is a contagious effect to it. Like you look around, you're saying, well, if everybody else is doing this, why shouldn't I do this? So I guess the question is, do you think there's more corruption going on now, or is it that there's more sensitivity to it because of who Donald Trump is and how ostentatious he is with that corruption?
I think it's the latter. I don't think there's necessarily more corruption going on now than in previous eras in Washington. I mean, certainly you could look to the Jack Abramoff era and the Tom DeLay era. You had John Boehner giving out checks on the House floor from tobacco lobbyists. You can go all the way back to Watergate. Trump's people are not good at it. So it's not well hidden in the way that it might be under a more sophisticated group of officials. So I do think that this is a deep-seated problem, and the report that really this story was covering from the Roosevelt Institute also makes the case that this is a deep-seated problem in American life that has a lot to do with how we fail to police corruption, how we only really are attentive to it in times of major scandal, like after Watergate or perhaps now.
That's interesting. Before we get specifically to that report unstacking the deck, one of the things that obviously in the news this week were $200,000 at least of payments from AT&T to Michael Cohen. At least, I don't know, it sounds like maybe $1 million plus now from Novartis to Michael Cohen. And my thought was like, wait a second, where did AT&T get the idea they could do this type of thing, right? Like this, they didn't come up with the idea. It seems to me that if they feel comfortable paying Michael Cohen this money, it's not the first time they've done this, right? And so this
it's not
is
the first time any corporation has done it. I mean, they call it consulting when it's not as overt as what Michael Cohen is doing. There are entire offices within large law firms in all over Washington where consultants, who are usually people who have attachments to the government, who have contacts within the government, are paid for their insights. There's an entire industry around it. It's called political intelligence. And, this has been on the table for a long, long time. And Michael Cohen is just so ham-handed about it that it sort of raises attention to this much, much larger, almost an industry of paying people who are marginally attached to people in power to, effectively lobby for them without calling it lobbying.
All right, well, let's talk about this report, Unstacking the Deck. It was issued from the Roosevelt Institute, and tell us about the report, and then let's talk about the authors, because in some respects, the authors are just as interesting as the report itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So the report, a lot of these reports are often about money and politics. You hear about corruption in the sense of somebody got a campaign donation and then they took an action on behalf of that campaign donor. And that's not actually what this report does. This report is about what they term as money in government. And it's around all of the money used to influence regulators at federal agencies and other policymakers to, again, take actions on behalf of that individual industry or company. But it's not about campaign contributions. It's about the lobbying expenses. It's about the expenses that companies like Google use to plant academic research. They pay academics to write research that's favorable to their policies. It's this whole blob of interests that push policymakers or attempt to push them in a certain direction. And as you said, it's notable who wrote this report. The authors were, affiliated with the Roosevelt Institute, Julie Morgan. The other one is a guy named Rohit Chopra. And Rohit Chopra wrote this while he was waiting to get confirmed to a commissioner position at the Federal Trade Commission. So he is now one of those officials on the other side of the table who is going to be subject to this large influence industry attempting to change his mind or get his vote on a whole variety of matters. I mean, the Federal Trade Commission covers advertising, which practically every consumer-facing industry engages in. It has jurisdiction over the tech industry, one of the largest spenders of lobbying funds in Washington. It has its tentacles in numerous parts of the economy, and now that firepower is going to be brought to bear on Rohit Chopra, who shows through this report that he knows exactly what he's in for.
He's a fascinating figure because I had heard of his work during the Obama administration when it came to, I think, if I remember correctly, student loans, but also in particular for-profit universities. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. He's a sort of protege of Elizabeth Warren, worked in the CFPB as the student loan ombudsman, later went to the education department where he tried to write rules on things like student loan servicing and for-profit colleges. So yes, he's been sort of at the forefront of a lot of these consumer issues, at least as they relate to students. And so, it's definitely notable that this is someone who's about to go into the government researching government corruption and knowing already, having already served in the government from the inside, knowing how the industry brings that influence to bear on people. There's real world experience within this report that you can just feel that this is the way things work.
All right. I want to talk a little more about this. We got to take a break. And when we come back, I want to talk a little more about that. I also want to talk about another piece you wrote, David, about the how our economy seems to be fundamentally broken. But we will touch a little bit more on this report, Unstacking the Deck, the governmental corruption, the broad corruption we have in our society and what we can do about it. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to the great David Dayen. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.